Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Firewalk by Chris Roberson, narrated by R.C. Bray. Prologue. 5 years ago. The killer wouldn't stop apologizing as he dismembered the corpse.
I'm so sorry. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. One more, and I'll be done.
Special Agent Izzie Lefevre lay on the rusted metal plates that formed the floor of the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. It felt like there was a seam of burning ice on her leg where the killer's blade had bit into her flesh, which only burned colder when Izzie tried unsuccessfully to stand.
I'm sorry.
The killer's voice was muffled behind the silver skull mask he wore, and sounded labored as he wrenched the corpse's left arm free of its socket.
It's too late to stop now.
Izzie had fired 2 rounds before the killer slashed the pistol from her grasp. The downward arc of the killer's forward-curving blade had continued, cutting deeply into her leg, and he had kicked her gun away from her when Izzie had collapsed on the floor. She pressed her right palm hard against the cut on the back of her left hand, trying to stanch the flow of blood, but without much success. Her radio was smashed to bits on the floor beside her. She hoped that Detective Tevake and the others had heard the shots, but with the rain pelting hard against the windows outside and the discordant speed metal blaring from the speakers at the bottom of the stairs, it didn't seem likely. She considered calling out for him, but there was the killer's blade to consider.
You don't have to do this, Nicholas.
Izzie's voice cracked as she spoke, and she tried again louder to be heard over the din.
You've won.
At the sound of his name, the killer paused, and his eyes shifted behind the mask as he looked in her direction.
What did you say?
You've won, Nicholas.
Whatever your disagreement with the others was about, it's over now. You've got what you wanted. There aren't any left.
Izzie made herself move her gaze to the mutilated corpse, the wide cut across the abdomen, the organs and intestines strewn across the floor, the severed limbs stacked like firewood.
Francis Zhao was the last one.
Holding the handle of his curved blade with his right hand, the killer used his left to push the skull mask up onto his forehead. Izzie saw tired, haunted eyes in the face of the man news reporters had dubbed the Recondito Reaper, but who she and the rest of the task force knew to be Nicholas Fuller, former researcher at Ross University. The dead man lying in pieces on the floor in front of him had been a co-worker years before.
You think I wanted this?
There was a desperate edge to the killer's voice. If he was surprised that Izzie knew his name, it didn't show.
I warned them. I know. The university administrators told us all about it.
She decided to try a different tack.
You have the power here. The power?
The killer stood up, gestured to the windows with the long, forward-curving blade, and then pointed to the floor.
The power is what I'm worried about. You think these will protect me for long?
Intricate patterns had been inscribed on the thick glass with a black marker, a riot of mathematical formulae, tight blocks of text, strange sigils. On the floor, a ring of salt surrounded pentagrams, hexagrams, spirals, and a confusion of other occult symbols etched in chalk, including a veve for protection that Izzie recognized from her childhood.
They are out there in the dark. More of them. Waiting.
The killer pulled the skull mask back down over his face.
And I have to stop the ones that are already here.
For a confused moment, Izzie thought that he meant the other police who were already on scene. Detective Tevake was downstairs, and the other 2 Recondito police officers were searching the living quarters next door with Supervisory Special Agent Henderson. But the killer couldn't have known about any of them. He was talking about something else. Something that had him terrified.
I want to understand.
Izzie tried to shift into a sitting position, then slammed back hard on her shoulder when the cut on her leg objected. She was lightheaded from the blood loss and having trouble focusing. She just needed to keep him occupied until the others came looking for her.
Explain it to me.
The killer knelt back down and grabbed the dead man's hair with one hand and started sawing at his neck with the other.
Gravity leaks into other spaces, but doors swing both ways. They went down into the dark, and the dark came back with them. Ridden. Passengers. I saw it, even if no one else did. I didn't understand it myself, until the old daykeeper gave me the key. He showed me how to walk through the fire and see the shadows for what they are. But now he's gone and there's just me. I only have one more to go, and my work is finished. Just one more.
The killer seemed to have forgotten she was there. His voice was little more than a murmur as he sawed and hacked at the dead man's neck, and she struggled to hear him over the music blaring downstairs.
One more what, Nicholas?
Had he targeted another victim? Was there a member of the university's undersight team that the task force had failed to identify? The killer stood up, holding the dead man's severed head by the hair.
The student. I have to find him, and then I will— Freeze!
Detective Patrick Tevake stood on the top step of the spiral staircase, aiming his pistol at the killer's back. The killer turned, severed head in one hand, blade in the other. When Izzie had entered the lantern room, he had been behind the door, catching her off guard. But now he was too far away for his blade to be of much use against the police officer's semi-automatic.
I said don't move! You can't stop me now.
The killer took a step forward, bringing him closer to where Izzie lay on the floor.
It's almost over.
5 rounds slammed into the killer's torso. As he staggered back, his blade fell and clattered on the metal plates while the severed head rolled across the floor, coming to rest at Izzie's side.
Almost,
the killer's voice gurgled as blood welled at the corners of his mouth. The killer fell backwards, shattering the window on impact. Broken symbols and ruined formulae rained down as he fell through. Izzie looked over at the severed head on the floor beside her. The dead man's eyes were closed, and his expression seemed strangely tranquil. She couldn't help but gasp.
Now it's over.
Detective Tevake had crossed the floor to look down at the killer's body on the white rocks below. He glanced over his shoulder at Izzie.
Agent Lefevre, you hanging in there?
Izzie could hear her pulse pounding in her ears. Her head swam. Darkness crawled at the edges of her vision.
Agent Lefevre?
The detective was coming towards her now, holstering his pistol.
Izzie?
The dead man had opened his eyes and was looking directly into hers. Now his mouth began to move, lips clearly forming words, though with no lungs to push air through his larynx, he made no sound. Then the darkness closed in around her.
Izzie, can you hear me?
Now.
Can you hear me?
Special Agent Izabelle Lefevre sat at her desk in the Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico, holding the cold plastic of her phone against her ear, listening to a voice she'd not heard in 5 years.
Yes,
she finally managed.
I can hear you. You have to come back to Recondito, Izzie.
Patrick Tevake sounded stricken.
It isn't over.
Chapter 1.
Business or pleasure?
Izzie stifled a sigh, and immediately regretting taking the earbuds from her ears as the plane began its descent. From the window seat she could see the skyline of Recondito coming into view below, the swirling waters of the estuary bay separated from the expanse of the Pacific Ocean by the narrow isthmus. She turned to the passenger in the middle seat and managed a wan smile.
Business. What kind of work are you in?
He was middle-aged, dressed in business casual, and was probably in management or sales at some big corporation. Since finishing the paperback novel that had kept him occupied since they boarded the connecting flight in Chicago, he'd been leafing through the in-flight magazine that he'd borrowed from Izzie somewhere over Utah. The cover story was about Martin Tevake, who'd gone from college dropout to self-made millionaire in the last few years after his software company, Parasol, released a series of killer apps for the mobile market. Izzie had several of the company's apps installed on her own phone, but had never heard of the Recondito-based entrepreneur until she read the in-flight magazine herself before giving it to her fellow passenger. That bit of trivia, and the fact that Parasol had recently finished renovating Recondito's landmark Pinnacle Tower, were the only points of interest in the article, which was only marginally more diverting than the crossword puzzle that had been left half-solved by some previous passenger, so she hadn't minded giving it up when the man had failed to find his own copy in the seat back in front of him. Izzie had been grateful that he didn't seem to be the chatty type, preferring to sit in silence with her own thoughts. But apparently he was instead the sort to wait until the safety of the final moments of a flight to engage with the passengers around him. Normally she might have hidden behind a book or magazine herself, but he had taken away her sole defense. The only reading materials she brought were case files, but she didn't feel comfortable bringing those out into the open where prying eyes might see things the public probably shouldn't, and so the files remained safely stored away in her bag, along with her FBI credentials and badge. "I'm an analyst." Like many bureau agents, Izzie was usually less than forthcoming about her employment when talking to strangers. It was easier in most situations to let a half-truth suffice than to be drawn into a conversation about sensitive matters with people who might ask questions that she couldn't answer. "What, like a psychologist?" "Something like that." Izzie's faint smile made a brief, flickering return, and then she broke eye contact to shift her gaze back out at the city spreading out below them. As the pilot banked to the south towards the airport situated at the bay's southern edge, she spotted the lighthouse that rose above the white rocks of Ivory Point. It was low tide, and the tiny island was connected to the isthmus by the muddy land bridge. "First time in Recondito?" Izzie's sigh was harder to suppress this time. Having ridden in silence since O'Hare, he was clearly intent on getting as much social engagement out of the flight's final moments as he could manage. She answered without looking away from the window. "No, I was here once before, but it's been a while." The scar on the side of Izzie's leg itched, and she resisted the temptation to bend down and scratch. 5 years.
5 years, that's all we've got." He chuckled. "Earth is really dying."
Izzie's head snapped around, and she narrowed her eyes suspiciously. He smiled.
"Like the David Bowie song, right? The one about the end of the world?"
Izzie realized that her hands were tightened into fists in her lap. She concentrated on relaxing them. "Oh, right." She knew her smile had to be even less convincing this time than before. A flight attendant appeared in the aisle, her hand brushing the man's shoulder. "Sir, can you return your seat to the upright position?" While he fiddled with the seat controls, Izzie slipped her earbuds back in, and by the time he turned back around she was busy acting as if she were engrossed in a stupid game on her phone. He tried once more to get her attention, but when she pretended not to hear, he turned and began pestering the passenger in the aisle seat instead. Izzie absently poked and swiped at the phone screen, but her mind was elsewhere. 5 years. Izzie had only been with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for a short while when she first traveled to Recondito. What little she knew about the city, outside of what she'd read in the case files on the ongoing investigation, she'd gleaned from popular culture. When she was in high school, she'd been a regular viewer of Behind the Lines, a primetime sitcom about a cartoonist that was set in the city, though all but the exterior establishing shots were clearly filmed on a soundstage in Hollywood. In college, she'd seen an old made-for-TV movie about the Eschaton Center on the outskirts of town that had been popular among film stars and rock musicians until a notorious mass murder-suicide closed its doors forever. Izzie knew a little about the city's music scene in the 90s, from listening to every CD that Siren had ever recorded over and over again, and had briefly considered a road trip to see the singer-songwriter perform live on the very stage where she'd begun her career. But in the end, Izzie decided she couldn't afford the expense on a student's budget. All of this served to give her a vague notion of what the city would be like when she first arrived. A small coastal city with picturesque fish markets and streetcars and museums, like she'd seen in the opening credits of the Behind the Lines sitcom. Coffee shops and theaters and gardens like Siren had sung about, and maybe even a few leftover hippies and counterculture types who had orbited the Eschaton crowd. Row houses and Mission Revival architecture and gleaming towers of glass and steel, the Pinnacle Tower and the docks, and the Hyde Park Green. And she'd found all of those things, just as she'd expected. But that was just surface, and the city was so much more. The locals sometimes called it the Hidden City, in part because of the bay around which Recondito was built, where the fresh waters of the Verada River mixed with the salty waters of the ocean. Early explorers had named the estuary the Hidden Bay when they nearly failed to notice it as they sailed along the coast, the narrow entrance almost completely obscured by the rocky white cliffs that rose on either side. But residents considered Recondito to be hidden in another sense as well. Bound by hills on one side and the ocean on the other with the bay in between, there were limits on how large the city could grow, which could have served to make the city quaint and insular. But Izzie found that the opposite was true. If anything, it boasted a richer and more varied culture than cities 10 times its size. The Hidden Bay had been home to a community of pre-Columbian hunter-gatherers in the days of the pharaohs, and in the millennia since, visitors to the area had included Spanish explorers, British sailors, New England whalers, Russian missionaries, and more. After a brief gold run in the 19th century, Recondito had become a home for immigrants, welcoming waves of newcomers from Ireland, France, the South Pacific, and elsewhere, all of them infusing elements of their own cultures into the city. Izzie saw evidence of that long history of cultural mixing and melding everywhere. The food was the first and most noticeable feature. Espresso in the sidewalk cafes along Rue de Livre, so strong that after one sip Izzie thought she would stay awake for a week. Savory pierogi from the bakeries in the Kiev. Rashers of bacon at an Irish pub in Ross Village that refused to serve stouts at anything colder than room temperature. Mouth-watering Polynesian pork and rice at a hole-in-the-wall in Ocean View that she ducked into just to get out of the rain. Taquerias and sushi bars and Thai restaurants and pizza joints and on and on. If not for her habit of running 3 miles every day at dawn, she was sure she'd have gained 30 pounds by the time she left. But the city's cultural heritage ran far deeper than items on a menu. Izzie had interacted with any number of people who were Recondito natives. Police officers and criminals, millionaires and vagrants, cab drivers, shopkeepers, college professors, and construction workers. Each of them clearly had a unique experience with the Hidden City, shaped in their own particular way by the place. The bookseller, who still proudly displayed the spiraling tattoos on her face and neck that she'd inked in her troubled youth as a gang member, the same tribal marks that her seafaring Polynesian ancestors would have worn. The scientist whose family had lived in the city when it was little more than a collection of rude huts around a Franciscan mission, who spent his days investigating the mysteries of the universe. Though she was there for months, Izzie always felt like a visitor to the city, and not simply because she slept in a hotel room and drove a rented car. It was because the longer she stayed in Recondito, the more she discovered about the place, and the more she realized there was left to discover. It was like one of those fractal images that revealed an ever-increasing amount of detail the closer you looked at them. When she finally left, she could navigate the city streets with ease, knew the best places to eat and the best bars for a late-night drink, but still felt as though she was only beginning to scratch the surface of the city. She hadn't expected ever to return, and after the way her last visit had ended, she was not entirely sanguine about returning now. But Patrick had insisted that he had something that she needed to see, something about the Reaper case that only she would understand. So here she was, back in the Hidden City again after all this time. Chapter 2. The junior agent from the resident agency was waiting in baggage claim with a sign on which she'd written Lefevre in neat block letters, and was dressed in a white shirt, dark pantsuit, and low-heeled boots. She had graduated from the FBI Academy at Quantico, so she couldn't be any younger than her mid-20s, but Izzie couldn't help thinking that she looked like she could still be in middle school. Had Izzie ever been that young? "Agent Lefevre?" she said as Izzie approached, holding the sign in both hands. Her voice had a tentative edge to it, like a fan approaching a pop star to ask for an autograph. "That's me," Izzie answered. In her suede jacket, T-shirt, and jeans, she might have passed for an academic on vacation or a session musician between gigs. "Special Agent Daphne Richardson." She lowered the sign and stuck out a hand to shake. "It's an honor, ma'am. Please call me Izzie." Daphne was probably only a year or two younger than Izzie had been when she'd first come to Recondito, and here she was treating her like a grand dame. Maybe she did want an autograph after all. "Do you have any—" Daphne glanced over at the baggage carousels. "We're not in any hurry if we need to wait." "This is it." Izzie hiked the strap of her go-bag higher on her shoulder. "Ready when you are." Daphne was absent-mindedly folding the sign into a tight bundle, the corners neat and precise. "My bureau car is parked in short-term." She started walking towards the exit, glancing over her shoulder as Izzie followed. "We've already got you checked in at the extended stay hotel across the street from the RA offices if you want to stop in and freshen up." "No need." Izzie ran a hand through her braids. Her grandmother would have scolded her for letting them get so fuzzy, she was sure. But Izzie had more important matters to worry about, like why she had abruptly returned to Recondito in the first place, and whether she would be getting any static from the senior resident agent for the somewhat flimsy justification for her presence. "I'd rather check in with the SRA sooner rather than later and get to work. Agent Gutierrez is meeting with the chief of the Recondito police at the moment, but he said he would probably be back at the office by the time we got there." Izzie tried not to see that as a red flag. From what she gathered from talking with Patrick Tevake, he hadn't been entirely forthcoming with his superiors about the connections he'd found between his present investigations and the Reaper case, for fear that they'd order him to undergo a psych evaluation at best and put him on suspension at worst. If the Bureau suspected that there was more to Izzie's visit to the city than she'd let on, that could prove problematic for both of them. And it was still entirely possible that Patrick was mistaken, after all. Maybe a psych evaluation wasn't the worst idea. But she wanted to see for herself first and then decide what to do when she had all of the facts at her disposal. It had taken a long medical leave and months of counseling for her to get back into fighting trim after she left Recondito the last time. Until Patrick had called the day before, Izzie had been convinced that the party line on Nicholas Fuller was the correct answer. But if what Patrick had told her was true— "This is me." Daphne pulled a keyring from her pocket and turned off the car alarm with a short pair of beeps. Her Bureau-issued car was a late-model compact hybrid with government plates. She popped the trunk for Izzie to toss in her go-bag, and then settled into the driver's seat while Izzie buckled up on the passenger side. When she turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. She rolled her eyes. "I really need to get this thing serviced. I think it's a problem with the battery, but I'm not sure." She turned the key back to the starting position, then tried again. The engine started, but the sound of it was all but completely drowned out by the cumbia music that blared from the speakers at a deafening volume. "Sorry," Daphne said sheepishly, blushing, and quickly stabbed the off button on the car stereo. "I did a stint at the field office in San Antonio and picked up a taste for it. Doesn't hurt my feelings," Izzie grinned, "though I prefer Zydeco myself." Daphne eased the car out of the parking spot and navigated through the garage. "Maybe we should go dancing some night while you're in town." She laughed, half joking and clearly half serious. "There's a great little club down in Ocean View I go to sometimes." "Maybe," Izzie allowed, though it didn't seem likely. It had been late spring when last Izzie was in Recondito, with clear blue skies occasionally punctuated by pouring rain. Now it was coming on winter, with slate-gray skies and days that seemed to end before they even begun. It was only late afternoon, and already the sun was starting to disappear over the Pacific, and the light that managed to reach down the concrete and steel canyons of the financial district was ruddy and weak. In the drive from the airport in the South Bay, Daphne had kept up a steady stream of pleasantries, pointing out new construction that had gone up in the last few years, recommending taquerias and food carts that had recently opened for business, inoffensive observations about the ways she suspected the city had changed since last Izzie had visited. It was when they were just a few blocks away from the resident agency offices that she finally got around to asking the question that Izzie had been expecting from the start. "So what was it really like, that night in the lighthouse?" Daphne had her eyes on the traffic ahead, both hands on the wheel, but her attention was on Izzie. "I read all of the reports when I was still at the academy," Daphne went on. "Everyone did, of course. It was required reading, but still, I would have read them anyway." Daphne cut her eyes to the side for an instant, tentatively. "You're kind of a hero of mine." Izzie shifted a little in her seat uncomfortably. "We were just doing the job." "Henderson's book had more detail, of course," Daphne said. "But I thought your field reports had more cogent observations." Thomas Henderson had retired from the Bureau a year after they wrapped up the investigation in Recondito. He was on the lecture circuit now, and Izzie had lost track of the number of times she'd switched on the TV to find Henderson appearing as a talking head on some cable news show. He'd made his name with a series of books about his experiences hunting serial killers for the BAU, starting with a bestseller about the Reaper case. Having read his field reports in the time that they worked together, Izzie strongly suspected that he'd hired someone else to ghostwrite the book for him. She doubted whether Henderson even knew what phrases like languid torpor or charnel house smell even meant. His diction and attitude never strayed from the Baltimore streets where he'd started out as a beat cop, no matter where his subsequent career in the Bureau had taken him. "Thanks." Izzie hadn't meant it to sound like a question, but knew that it did. Daphne turned off of Prospect Avenue onto Hauser, and Izzie recognized the building that housed the FBI's Recondito resident agency a few blocks up the street. "So," Daphne said, "what was it really like?" Izzie sighed and forced a smile. "It was a rough night, I'll admit, but it worked out all right in the end." Assuming, of course, that it really did end. The offices of the resident agency were pretty much as Izzie had remembered them from the months that she spent there 5 years before. The computers had been upgraded and the phone system replaced, but otherwise the desks and cubicles of the small bullpen were the same as they'd been when she'd been assigned to the Reaper task force. She was pretty sure that all of the tongue-in-cheek motivational posters and comic strips clipped from newspapers pinned to the corkboard were the same ones that had already been yellowing when last she had been there. Recondito wasn't large enough of a city to merit more than a 2-person resident agency on a regular basis, and though the nearest field office was in San Francisco, due to workload requirements, the Recondito office actually reported to the Portland field office. Aside from Daphne and senior resident agent Gutierrez, who were the only 2 FBI agents on permanent assignment in Recondito, there was a small staff of support personnel that worked in the office on a part-time basis, file clerks, computer technicians, translators, and a custodial crew that serviced the entire building. When Daphne and Izzie arrived, though, the place was empty. After signing in, Izzie checked out a few clips worth of ammunition for her semi-automatic from the gun vault, just as a matter of course. She charged a clip into her pistol's magazine, and after returning it to the hip holster that rode slightly behind her right hip bone, slipped the rest of the clips into an inner pocket of her suede jacket. "You can use this desk while you're here. The phone extension is 214. Daphne indicated a cubicle along the north wall of the bullpen, opposite the door to the senior resident agent's office. "Dial 9 to get an outside line, and I remember." Izzie dropped her go-bag onto the desk. "Spent a lot of time on these phones." "Oh." Daphne seemed a little embarrassed. "Of course. I'll probably be using my mobile most of the time." Izzie patted her right pants pocket. The touch of the smartphone through the fabric of her jeans was strangely comforting, and Izzie resisted the urge to pat her other pockets in sequence, as she did every morning. Like most agents, she could be pretty ritualistic about her equipment, making her own sign of the cross every day before leaving her apartment. Phone, FBI credentials, firearm, ammunition, handcuffs. Almost every morning, Izzie couldn't help but remember her grandmother checking her gris-gris bag and charms each day before leaving her house in the 9th Ward. Mama Jean wouldn't go out into the world without her defenses, even if there was no reason to suspect that she'd have need of them. It was no different for Izzie, though she was concerned with real-world threats and not superstitious nonsense. A mojo hand might have given an old woman a feeling of security when facing imaginary threats like haints and conjuremen, but a sack full of charms, roots, and bits of bone wouldn't be much use against a sociopath with a gun. Of course, Izzie's pistol and badge hadn't been much use against a drug-addled schizophrenic with a blade, so it occurred to her that perhaps she couldn't be too judgmental. Izzie was about to call Patrick Tevake to see when he could meet her at the morgue when the door to the office banged against the wall and a storm came blowing in. The storm was a
Sample complete. Ready to continue?